Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on Chapter 13. So with Chapter 13, we start another unit. So this is Unit 4, and I like to say that in this unit, we kind of shift away from like the hard sciences of biology and chemistry, and we move more into some of the social science aspects of nutrition. So Chapter 13, we'll be talking pretty exclusively about body weight. We'll talk about what it means to have a healthy body weight, and then we'll also explore some of the health risks associated with having a too high body weight, as well as some of the health risks associated with having a too low body weight, and what to do on either end of that spectrum to try to bring oneself or bring another person back towards a healthy body weight. So up front, let's spend a little bit of time discussing what this means, actually. What does a healthy body weight mean? I'm actually going to start at the bottom here because I think this is one of the most important pieces, is that body weight in a lot of regards is what you feel comfortable with, what a person feels comfortable with in his or her or their own body. Some of the other things we can say is that a healthy body weight would be appropriate for age and physical development. I think this is a good one too. It's a body weight that a person can achieve and maintain without constant dieting, without like continually maybe fretting about their body weight. So it's something that can be achieved and sustained, I guess, healthfully. We could also look at some other markers of health. So blood pressure, lipid levels, glucose tolerance, insulin, basically having non-insulin resistance, so good insulin response. So we would say that a body weight that also supports healthy lipid profile, healthy blood pressure, and healthy glucose tolerance would be a healthy body weight. And then, of course, body weight is going to be very genetically and ethnically based too. So depending on the person's personal and familial background, that's going to affect what healthy means for their body type. And then this one, again, a healthy body weight is one that is supported by healthy eating habits, as well as a body weight that allows for regular physical activity, right? So this, I think, kind of goes up here with this one. Again, a body weight is one that we can achieve and maintain with healthful eating practices, and it's also a body weight at which we can be regularly physically active without any sort of, physical restraints on ourselves, on the body due to weight. So there are three ways that we can basically assess or evaluate body weight. There's what we call body mass index, or BMI. There's something called body composition, and then there's something called fat distribution patterning. So we'll look at each one of these. Start with BMI. This is maybe the one that you have heard of most commonly. It's certainly very commonly used, but that doesn't mean that it is great. So body mass index is basically a ratio of a person's weight to their height. And sorry, again, if I haven't said it before, these lectures were sort of automatically typed by the textbook company, and then I've gone through and made a bunch of edits, but sometimes I miss some of the, I guess, genderizing. So forgive me there. So body mass index represents a ratio of a person's weight to their height, but it's technically to the square of their height. So here it is written out in sort of more mathematical terms. So weight, and you can do it in imperial or metric system. So it would be kilograms to meters squared, or it would be pounds to inches squared. But in this case, if you're going to use the imperial measuring system, you have to multiply by this additional 700, this number 703. So most of the time we just go with kilograms to meters squared for weight to height squared. I'll show you a chart on the next page. The BMI values typically range from 18.5 to 30. And then of course, some people do wind up measuring in below 18.5, and some people do wind up measuring in above 30. So below and above these two values is where we have increased health risk. So let's see, I think actually I have several slides to kind of go through these numerical values. So oftentimes you'll find BMI charts, and if you want to Google BMI charts, you'll find BMI charts based on different age groups and also based on male or female. So up top here, you'll see that range, 18.5 to 30. And then over here on the right, you'll see the key for these different colors. So below 18.5 is what we call underweight. And then in this range from 18.5 to 25, or you'll sometimes see it written as 24.9. That's the range that we consider healthy weight. And then in that range from 25 to 30, we call that overweight. But you'll notice, if we come back here, 25 to 30 is still within this range. So actually, people who fall into this overweight category are still technically healthy. There is no increased health risk in this 25 to 30 BMI range. Obviously, as you start to approach 30 and then get above 30, that's what we call obesity. And obesity, as we'll see, is associated with pretty severe health consequences. So I guess that would be the only health risk, is being in this higher end of the overweight category, is recognizing that you're approaching obesity. And then again, this is weight to height. So you can actually, roughly find yourself on this chart and see where you land in these BMI categories. So kind of for your reference, here are the different BMI categories written out. So underweight is a BMI that is 18.5 kilograms to meters squared or less. And this is considered a health risk because it may actually be too low in body fat to maintain good health. If you need a refresher on why lipids are so important to the body, definitely go back and review the chapter on lipids. And then again, that normal weight or healthy weight is 18.5 to 24.9. Overweight is 25 to 29.9. Typically being overweight, and let me say BMI, I'll say this again in another slide, BMI does not actually account for body fat, but it is assumed that once the BMI comes above this 25 number, that there is likely to be an excess amount of body fat. But that's not always true. And then obesity, there's different classes of obesity, but again, obesity is anything above 30. So class 1 is basically 30 to 35, class 2 is 35 to 39.9, and then there is class 3, which is also called morbid obesity, where a BMI is greater than or equal to 40 kilograms per meter squared. And so again, BMI does not actually tell us how much body fat a person has, but it is assumed that above this BMI of 30, we continue to have an increasing excess of body fat. And as we'll talk about, it's this excess of body fat that becomes the health risk. So the excess body fat actually starts to decrease our health and increase our risk for developing other chronic diseases. So then, of course, morbid obesity just puts, as your BMI increases point by point by point, a person is at an continually increased risk for adverse health effects and chronic disease. So this is definitely an important slide, limitations of BMI. As I've been saying, we do not, BMI does not give us a measure of body fat or what we call body composition. We're going to talk about body composition next, so that will make a little bit more sense. BMI is also not really appropriate for very old people and very young people. And much of that has to do with, as we age, we lose bone and muscle mass. And for children, as they're growing, growth can be at pretty different rates depending on the child. And so at any given point in time, they might not really fall accurately on a BMI chart. Also, BMI is not appropriate for most athletes and for pregnant and lactating females. And then let's see, BMI does not account for the physical and metabolic differences in ethnic backgrounds. So pretty strong limitations to BMI, and yet it is still one of the most commonly used measures to assess healthy body weight. So here is body composition. So body composition basically estimates the amount of body fat relative to the amount of lean mass on the body. Lean mass accounts for, as we see, well, it doesn't quite say it back here, but basically lean mass is accounting for bone and muscle mass. So body composition basically compares total body fat to the rest of the mass of the body, which would be primarily made up from muscle and bone. So there are many different ways that we can assess body composition. There's something called underwater weighing, skin fold measurements, bioelectrical impedance, near infrared reactance. We can use the DEXA scan, which is used to assess bone health, and we can also use something called a bod pod. Yeah, norms of body composition vary greatly according to sex and to fitness levels. So obesity, we can actually define obesity based on body composition. For males, obesity is considered to be having like 25% or greater body fat, and for females, it's having 32% or greater body fat. And then I just want to point out here, because these are common test questions, we'll see on the next slide, underwater weighing is the most accurate measurement of body composition. That probably will be a test question for the Unit 3 exam. This will all go on your final, sorry. So this will be a question on your final exam. Underwater weighing is the most accurate assessment of body composition. Skin fold measurement is the most accessible. It's the cheapest. You can do it in common college nutrition labs. Like if you were to go on to a 4-year college, very easy to do. You can do this at a doctor's office. And then bioelectrical impedance analysis. This is also increasingly accessible in terms of finance and machinery. So you can even now buy scales for your home that can do a little bioelectrical impedance analysis. Also, gyms and doctors' offices are increasingly having bioelectrical impedance analysis machines at their offices. So on this slide, this is a figure from your book as always, but this page goes through all these different measurements. So underwater weighing, again, this is considered the most accurate method for assessing body composition. It is, however, very expensive and not really accessible to the public. So it's not one that is commonly used except for research purposes. So again, at like large institutions or universities doing extensive nutrition research, there may be access to an underwater weighing setup. Then the skin fold measurement, as I said, this one is super accessible, very easy to access. It may not be super accurate. It's definitely not as accurate as underwater weighing, but it at least gives you, gives you an idea. And it's suggested, the margin of error is only about 3 to 4%, so it's not terrible. And then here's the bioelectrical impedance analysis machine. Also going to be less accurate than underwater weighing, but again, pretty easy to access these days. And this is kind of interesting. So it'll send basically a small electrical current through the body, and then it measures the rate at which the current passes through the body. And so the current is going to pass more slowly through your more dense tissue, which would be your muscle tissue. And so in that way, it can assess the amount of muscle tissue and bone tissue relative to fat tissue. One of the limitations here, though, is that, let's see if it's written, body fluid levels must be normal. Yeah, so this one can be really strongly affected by hydration status. So if a person is not well hydrated, this machine is going to read pretty inaccurately. But again, the margin of error generally is about 3 to 4%. And then there's the DEXA and the BOD pod. You can kind of read more about those, but these would be the 3 that I want you to know for our purposes. Okay, and then the third way that we can assess fat distribution, the third way that we can assess healthfulness of body weight is something called fat distribution patterning. I think this one's kind of cool because you can even start to kind of, as you're out in the public and you're seeing different people and different body types, you can start to see this type of fat distribution patterning. So we have basically 2 types we call apple-shaped patterning and pear-shaped patterning. So apple-shaped patterning is where, I guess it just says upper body. Apple-shaped patterning, a more appropriate thing to say is that the excess body fat is stored here in the abdominal region. So that's why, I guess it kind of looks like an apple. This is the one of these 2 body types. The apple-shaped patterning is associated with a greater increased risk for chronic diseases. This is also a common test question. Which of these 2 is associated with increased health risk? So it's the apple-shaped patterning. And the reason for that, we'll get into at the end of this chapter, is that right in here in your abdomen, this is where all of your vital organs are. And so this excess body fat being stored around these vital organs can actually start to affect their functioning. Whereas pear-shaped fat patterning is where a person stores their excess body weight more in the buttocks and the hips and the upper thighs. So I guess we say lower body. So in pear-shaped patterning, we actually do not see an increased risk for chronic disease because there's no vital organs stored in the upper thighs, the hips, and the buttocks. It tends to be that males show more of the apple-shaped fat patterning, and females tend to show more of this pear-shaped fat patterning. So this is another important slide. This is really all we'll say about fat distribution patterning, but recognize that this is the third way of assessing a healthy body weight. So technically, again, at any point having too much excess body fat will be problematic, but if someone is storing most of that excess fat down here in the hips and the buttocks, that would be considered healthier than storing the fat up here in the abdomen. Oh, right. Yeah, this is important too. I forgot there was the second page. This is really important. So we can also, rather than just looking, we can also assess the amount of fat stored in these 2 areas of the body by measuring waist circumference. And you can also compare waist circumference to hip circumference, and that's considered waist to hip ratio. But even easier than that waist to hip ratio is doing just basic waist circumference measurement. So this is another really useful assessment of health risk. So for males, having a waist circumference above 40 inches or 102 centimeters is associated with increased health risk. And for females, having a waist circumference above 35 inches is associated with increased health risk. You can also look at waist to hip ratio, and I should double check myself here. I'll put a link to the week content for this chapter, but For males, for waist to hip ratio, I believe it's just a 1-to-1, whereas for females, if it's a 0.8, anything above a 0.8 is increased with an increased health risk, and that's the ratio of waist to hip circumference. So this is basically still in that same conversation of the fat distribution patterning, but rather than just assessing it visually, we can actually measure it. Okay, so that's basically just an overview of what body weight is and how to measure the healthfulness of body weight. Another thing we can do is to talk about, actually put some numerical value behind all this even further. So we can talk about this concept of energy balance. Energy balance is basically we're comparing the amount of energy that comes into the body, which is pretty much through food and beverage. Compare that to the amount of energy expended by the body, which we'll talk about. There's actually 3 different parts of energy expenditure. So maybe the obvious would be like physical activity is going to be energy expended. But we'll see there's 2 other things that also contribute to that expenditure. So within this concept of energy balance, we can have an actual true balance where the amount of energy coming in is equal to the amount of energy going out. And in that case, we would have basically healthy weight maintenance. Well, I guess it's not always healthy, but we would have weight maintenance. So weight would not be going up or going down. Then we have what could be called energy deficit, where the amount of energy going out is higher than the amount of energy coming in. That's typically associated with weight loss. And then we can have energy excess, which is where the amount of energy coming in is greater than the amount going out. And that's typically where we have weight gain. So again, figure 13.4 from your book, basically just giving a visual to what I've just said. So right, we'll start in the middle again. Energy balance, the amount of calories coming in and going out are equal. So a person would be in weight maintenance. Again, this could also be somebody who's either underweight or overweight. If their amount of energy coming in is equal to the amount they're spending, they're going to maintain whatever weight they're currently at. So that's not always, I mean, again, this image is showing a healthy person, but weight maintenance doesn't always mean the body weight is healthy. Hopefully it is, and hopefully that's where, everybody can get to, is a place of healthy weight maintenance. But just, I think, an interesting point to note. And then energy deficit, again, where the energy expended is greater than the energy coming in. So a person would be losing weight. Again, that's not always healthy either, right? That could be an unhealthy and excessive weight loss. And then there's energy excess, where the amount coming in is greater than the amount expended, and that's going to lead to weight gain. Again, the image here is making it look very unhealthy. Again, it can be, and we do see a lot of this in the United States, but in some cases, if a person has been at an unhealthy underweight, we actually want to help move that person to a temporary place of energy excess to help them gain weight back. Okay, so let's take a quick look at energy intake. This should all be a review from Unit 1 and 2, but just remembering that when we consume foods that provide macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and also alcohol, we are consuming energy in the form of calories. So you might recall that protein and carbohydrate both provide 4 calories of energy per gram of that nutrient, and fat provides 9 calories per gram of that nutrient. That's why we say fat is the most energy dense of the 3 macronutrients. And then alcohol is actually more energy dense than carbohydrate or protein, providing 7 calories per gram of alcohol. So this is just a kind of an example of a simple meal here, really simple meal, just quick oats. So 1 cup of quick oats is providing a total of 142 calories. And what your textbook has done here is actually break it out per macronutrient. So 1 cup of quick oatmeal has 6 grams of protein, 2 grams of fat, and 25 grams of carbohydrates. And so then using these numbers up top, we can determine how many calories were provided by each macronutrient. So the carbohydrate obviously was the most abundant. So at 4 calories per gram, it does provide the most calories, 100 calories of the 142. There's only 2 grams of fat. So 2 grams of fat, multiply that by 9 calories per gram. The fat provides 18 calories. And then 6 grams of protein, multiply that by 4 calories per gram. And the protein provides 24 calories. So again, obviously then add those 3 values up and you get that 142 calorie total. So this is part of what the My Diet Analysis project is all about. I didn't ask you to do these specific calculations, but you did have to put your food into an energy calculator, a calorie calculator, to assess how many calories you were consuming on a given day. And then that's compared to your calorie expenditure, or at least an estimation of your calorie expenditure. And so you can start to assess where you fall in this energy balance concept. All right, and then energy expenditure. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about energy expenditure. So energy expenditure is all energy that is expended to maintain basic body functions and to perform activities, physical activities. So energy expenditure, I said, is made up of 3 components. Again, perhaps most obviously is that energy expended to perform physical activity, or we say energy cost of physical activity. And then the other 2 components are what's called basal metabolic rate and thermic effect of food. So let's go through each one of these. Oh, and here's your little pie chart. So the 3 components of energy expenditure, this is actually important. You'll notice the one that makes up the most is basal metabolic rate. The one that makes up the least is this thermic effect of food. And then the physical activities of daily living, you'll notice, has quite a range. And that's because people do varying amounts of physical activity. So the extent to which physical activity is going to play into energy expenditure depends on the amount of physical activity and the quality and the duration performed. So we'll start with basal metabolic rate. Definitely, please make sure you understand that this is different from BMI, body mass index. I know these are 2 very similar abbreviations, BMR, BMI, but they're 2 very different concepts. Well, they're very related, but they're very different. So basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate we could define simply as the amount of energy, which is calories, right? Anytime you see energy in this class, we're talking about calories. And so it's the amount of calories or energy expended to maintain basal, hence basal metabolic rate, basal functions of the body. So this term basal means at baseline, basically, or technically, literally at rest. So I don't think it's really written here, but this basal metabolic rate is literally the amount of energy that a person expends in 24 hours time, so one day, at rest. So if you were to lay in bed resting for 24 hours, your body is still going to be expending quite a bit of energy just to maintain your baseline body functions. If we go back here, we just said that BMR makes up the bulk of total energy expenditure, more than 50% and even approaching 3/4, 75% of all energy expended during the day. So basal metabolic rate is a pretty large number of calories expended each day. So what are these basic functions of the body? Well, this is breathing. This is your blood circulating. This is thermoregulation, maintaining your body temperature. This is any sort of cellular repair or new cell growth. This is making and secreting hormones. And this is your nervous system at work. So basal metabolic rate is going to vary pretty greatly among different people. And then also worth noting, the primary determinant of basal metabolic rate is that amount of lean tissue mass or lean body mass, which again is muscle and bone. I'm not going to write that out because of writing with a mouse. So muscle and bone is what I mean there. And so that goes back to body composition, right? Somebody who has a body composition that is, relatively low in total fat mass and higher in muscle mass or lean body mass is going to have a higher basal metabolic rate than someone who is of equal body weight but having higher body fat mass and less lean mass. So this is, let me start this page. This is a really important page. Also, probably important to help you understand BMR a little bit better. So these are some factors that affect basal metabolic rate. Over here we have things that increase BMR, and on the right we have factors that decrease BMR. You'll see they're mostly opposites. But increasing BMR, having more lean tissue, height also affects BMR. Age also affects BMR. So as we age, our BMR decreases. Having higher thyroid hormone is going to increase your metabolic activity, that hyperthyroidism. When we're under a lot of stress and when we're sick, that also increases our BMR. Males tend to have higher BMR than females. But again, during pregnancy and lactation, basal metabolic rate goes up, of course, because there's a lot of new growth happening here and production. And then also some drugs and stimulants will increase BMR. And then on the right, you'll see that kind of all the opposites decrease BMR. So having lower lean body mass, being shorter, being older, having depressed thyroid hormone levels or hypothyroidism. Also under times of starvation or when we're fasting, we're going to decrease our BMR. Females tend to have less lean tissue relative to males, so females tend to have a lower BMR. And then also certain steroids and other medications can decrease BMR. Okay, so the two other components of energy expenditure are thermic effect of food and the energy cost of physical activity. So thermic effect of food is kind of a cool one, I think. TEF is just the energy that we expend to process or digest food. So it's not a huge component of total energy expenditure, but it is about 5 to 10%. 5 to 10% of the energy content of a meal. If we go back to our pie chart, yeah, still about 5 to 10% of total BMR. So this is important here too. The components of the meal are going to determine the thermic effect of food. So foods that are more complex, like this is part of why the recommendation around grain foods is to eat more whole grain foods, because they are more complex and they require more energy to process and digest. This is also part of the recommendation for eating more solid foods and fewer liquid foods, because liquid calories don't require much digestion, whereas solid foods require quite a bit more digestion before we can absorb the calories. So the thermic effect of food is also going to be dependent on the types of food and the quality of the food. And then lastly, we have the energy cost of physical activity. So as I said, probably the one with which we are the most familiar. So about 15 to 35% of total energy expenditure, we said, it comes from physical activity. So again, this is a pretty wide range, again, totally depending on how much activity a person does. So there are two components of physical activity, or excuse me, the energy cost of physical activity. So there are non-exercise activities, and then there are basically exercise activities. So non-exercise activities basically include spontaneous physical activities like fidgeting in your chair, listening to this lecture, or like shifting in your seat, you know, crossing your legs, uncrossing your legs, putting one ankle up on your knee, right? And then just kind of moving around, leaning on the desk, getting off the desk. All that sort of little stuff is what's considered spontaneous physical activity. And so physical activity generates heat, and that heat is energy, and that's energy expended. And again, in our conversation on energy, that's calories expended by the body. So this is an important little note in here. These are calories above, these are activities above basal metabolic rate. So we're not including activities like breathing, blood circulation, maintaining body temperature, building new cells, making hormones, and nervous system activity. This would again be stuff like fidgeting, even simple things like, you know, washing dishes, making your bed, doing laundry, folding laundry, sweeping, vacuuming. So non-exercise activities. And then there's this little acronym NEAT, which is just referring to the thermogenesis, or the amount of heat given off from these non-exercise activities. So that's one part of the energy cost of physical activity. And then the second part is that intentional higher intensity activities. So basically exercise or intentional activity. So running, skiing, biking, pretty much, those are just three little things, but anything you might do. So this is table 13.2 from your book. This includes both non-exercise activities and exercise activities, as you'll see. And an intensity qualification is given, so light to moderate to leisurely to vigorous, right? There's a couple of vigorous in here. So this is both non-exercise activities and exercise activities are in here, like sitting and studying, right? You're expending some calories to do that, but just obviously not a ton. Even like walking to your neighbor's house, that's obviously going to expend some calories. Cleaning, like I said, and then if you come down here, obviously some exercise. So weightlifting, riding the bike, and then running either at a moderate or vigorous pace. You'll notice here too, here's walking at a brisk pace, like actually going out for like an exercise walk versus walking to your neighbor's house. And you'll notice here as well, bicycling at a leisurely pace versus bicycling for exercise. So on the far right is where we get the estimated energy cost. So the amount of energy expended. And this is written as the calories expended per kilogram of body weight per minute of the activity. And let me just erase this so, yeah, you can see that they're all decimals. On the next slide here, I pulled this example from your textbook, but basically, this just kind of goes through how you can kind of figure out using these numbers, how you can plug in, right, your body weight in kilograms, and then, you know, use these numbers to figure out how much energy you might expend doing this activity over a certain length of time. So kind of a concept we're going to get to in a minute, but if you're trying to increase your energy expenditure, the best way to do that is to increase physical activity and do it for a longer period of time. So here is this example. So a 200-pound male is going to go running at a pace of 6 miles per hour, and the time spent will be 30 minutes. So if we go back here, we can see running for 6 miles per hour is going to expend 0.163 calories for every kilogram of body weight on that person for each minute of the activity performed. So here's the simple conversion of pounds to kilograms. Divide the pounds by 2.2, and that gives you kilograms. And then we can figure out, all right, this number is just pulled from the chart on the previous slide. And then here is where we plugged in these numbers. So 0.163 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight body weight is 90.19 kilograms. So that tells us that per minute, this person is going to expend 14.82 calories running. And then this person is running for 30 minutes. So we simply take that number and multiply it by 30 minutes. And that says that over those 30 minutes, this 200-pound male is going to burn 445 calories running at a pace of 6 miles per hour. So again, also if you, using the My Diet Analysis software, if you plugged in your energy expenditure for part 1, or plugged in your activity levels, you might have seen that it estimated how much energy you expended doing the various activities you were doing. So a lot of websites and apps and there are a lot of tools now that are pretty easily accessible to us to assess the amount of calories, or to estimate, I should say, the amount of calories that we expend doing various types of activities. And this basic equation up here is used to assess that energy expenditure. Okay, so how do we assess the energy expenditure, as I've been saying here? Two kind of more official methods, basically this concept of calorimetry. So calorimetry, we have direct and indirect calorimetry. Calorimetry literally measures the amount of heat released by something. Direct calorimetry is measuring the amount of heat released by the body. This requires an airtight chamber so that over a certain length of time, the amount of heat coming off the body can be assessed. This is pretty expensive, right? Pretty inconvenient, so we don't use it all that often. We do use a form of direct calorimetry to get a pretty close approximation of the amount of calories in a food. And that's typically done actually by exploding the food. There's something called bomb calorimetry, B-O-M-B, and a food is literally exploded inside of a little chamber, and the amount of heat that comes off that food is measured, and that's how we determine the amount of calories in that food. So indirect calorimetry is another kind of more technical way of measuring the amount of energy expended. So indirect calorimetry doesn't actually measure the heat directly, that's why it's indirect. Instead, it measures the amount of oxygen consumed and the amount of carbon dioxide given off, right? So this is a less expensive measurement. It is more accessible to humans. Here's the example, right? So a person would have to have this little like bubble chamber over their head, and you'll see like their full body is kind of enveloped in this kind of bubble. And in that way, the scientist or whomever can measure the amount of oxygen that this person is breathing in and the amount of carbon dioxide that this person is breathing out. So again, this can be used to assess energy expenditure. It does not tell us separately BMR, TEF, and energy cost of physical activity. It just gives us an assessment of total energy expenditure from this person. Yeah, so there's this way, and then there's the sort of mathematical way. And again, a lot of, as I was referring to earlier, a lot of apps that you might use to track your calorie intake and your calorie expenditure are going to use an equation like this to determine how much energy you might expend doing various physical activities. And there's another equation that we won't get into so much in this class. There's another equation to assess basal metabolic rate. And so the app would use your basal metabolic rate plus whatever physical activity you might be doing to kind of give you an approximate calorie target for the day. Because an app isn't going to put everybody into an indirect calorimetry machine to get a more accurate assessment of their energy expenditure. Okay, so now we can start to talk about what are some of the things that affect body weight. First, we're going to go through some genetic factors. Actually, let me switch to highlighter. We're going to go through some genetic factors first, but we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this concept of what are the various things that affect body weight. So some genetic factors: height, weight, shape of the body, and metabolic rate. These can all be influenced by genes. And even as we'll see, weight potentially is also genetically based to some extent. So body mass index based on genetic factors is based on genetic factors as well as non-genetic environmental and lifestyle factors. So the degree to which genes affect BMI can vary pretty extensively, right? And we don't have a very precise way of knowing just yet the extent to which genes influence body weight, especially relative to non-genetic factors, environmental factors, and lifestyle factors. So your book goes through 5 different theories about how genes might affect body weight. I can't stress enough the importance of knowing that these are theories. These are not facts. These are just theories that we're thinking about, and some of them aren't even theoretical yet. They're literally still in the form of hypotheses. So let's talk about a few of these. So there's something called the fat mass and obesity associate gene theory, or the FTO gene theory. So this suggests that there's this gene which has been identified, and it's called the fat mass and obesity gene, so the FTO gene. About roughly half the population is estimated to have this gene. And this gene has been associated with higher levels of hunger, increased intakes of high fat foods and refined carbohydrate foods, and even increased depressive symptoms. So with all of that, it is assumed that people who express this gene basically eat more, are satisfied less, and are therefore more likely to be overweight or obese. Good news is people who have this gene can actually kind of decrease the effects of this gene by engaging in regular physical activity. Then there's the Thrifty gene theory. I guess of all these theories, I like this one the best. So this proposes that there is a gene or maybe a few genes that cause people who express that gene to be energetically thrifty. So that means that they're thrifty, like frugal almost. So people who possess this gene might expend less energy at rest than people who don't have this gene. So I guess I like this theory because there's some historical context here. So this would suggest that this has been applied to like indigenous populations in the United States, but I think we could apply it even more historically, almost more broadly to a lot of almost all humans. But during periods of extreme food shortages, people have managed to survive, right? And so this thrifty gene theory suggests that people who have this gene, when food is not abundant and not available, this gene allows people to expend less energy at rest. It allows people to basically decrease their basal metabolic rate, which would allow them to safely get through a period of extreme food shortages. And so then that person and those genes go on existing. One of the limitations of this theory is that this gene has not been identified. And again, the thinking here is that in modern times, a lot of people now don't experience, regular food shortages. And so in a world of abundant food, somebody who expresses the thrifty gene might be more prone to obesity because their energy expenditure at rest might be lower than somebody not expressing this gene. So again, theoretical. Then there's the Setpoint Theory. This is maybe one of my least favorite theories, but I feel like it gets talked about quite a lot. I think it's pretty straightforward. It just suggests that a person's body weight is basically set genetically to stay within a narrow range, or what would be called a set point. So this suggests that no matter what a person eats or how they exercise, that their body weight is always going to be maintained within a certain set point. Then there's something called the protein leverage hypothesis, and again I've underlined the notion that this is a hypothesis. So this line of thinking suggests that humans have evolved to have a fixed daily protein need in order to function optimally physiologically. And so until a person reaches that set protein amount, they're going to continue eating to try to reach that protein amount. Not consciously, obviously, but sort of on a sort of pre-programmed genetic level. So again, in modern times, with this kind of massively increasing rise in obesity rates, this hypothesis suggests that because modern foods and modern diets are pretty processed or composed of highly processed foods that are high in fat, high in refined carbohydrates, and low in protein, that people are going to be eating a lot of calories to try to reach that protein target. And so by the time they reach that protein target, they've taken in, 1,000 extra calories, 500 extra calories. And so maybe this is part of what's contributing to obesity and overweight. Yeah, so that's the protein leverage hypothesis. And then the last one is the Drifty gene hypothesis. So not thrifty, but drifty, meaning literally like drift in the gene pool. So this one I think is kind of interesting, again, suggesting that there's a gene that that causes some people to become obese, and some people have this gene, some people don't. And it's also suggested that this is actually a genetic mutation, and so and then that this genetically mutated gene drifts through the gene pool. So some people have it, some people don't. And so people who have this gene mutation, or these drifting genes, basically lack this ability to control their upper limit for healthy body weight, and so are therefore more prone to obesity. Whereas people who don't have this genetic mutation then can enact a basic genetic regulation of their upper limit for body weight. So again, all ideas. We haven't necessarily proven any of these to be true, but just, I guess, some interesting ways to think about how genes may be affecting body weight. But again, I'll go back to this slide here. We really have no precise way of saying the extent to which genetic factors influence body weight, and it may be actually a really high influence in some people, but it may also be a really low influence in other people. So very theoretical at this point. Then there are metabolic factors that affect body weight. These are much less theoretical, much more factual, much more known. So of course, having a low basal metabolic rate is going to cause a person to more easily gain weight. Also, not engaging in spontaneous physical activity or physical activity. But this I think is really interesting. And like fidgeting, the amount of fidgeting has been studied relative to body weight. And it actually shows that people who fidget more tend to have lower body weights because their energy cost of physical activity is higher just from that fidgeting. So this is spontaneous physical activity. Also, people who seem to have low sympathetic nervous system activity, so that's the fight or flight, seem to have lower total energy expenditure, so more, I guess, prone to having higher body weight. Also low fat oxidation, meaning they're not using fat as much as an energy substrate, so likely to hold on to it more or hold on to more fat. Also, as we saw, low thyroid level is going to decrease a person's total BMR, making it more easy to gain weight. And then certain prescription medications can slow metabolic rate and or stimulate appetite. So those would be things like lots of antidepressants, lots of birth control, medications for seizures, and many steroids would decrease BMR, and potentially stimulate appetite. So again, leading to a greater likelihood of increased body weight. Other moving on to physiologic factors. So hunger and satiety. We talked about this back in Unit 1, but you might remember there are a lot of different proteins and hormones that affect hunger and satiety. So we talked about leptin and ghrelin. We did not talk about peptide YY, and we haven't really talked about brown adipose tissue. But all of these affect regulation of appetite as well as the storage of body fat. So you might remember leptin. This is a hormone that's actually produced by adipose tissue, and it basically helps to like initiate that sensation of satiety. So typically leptin would reduce food intake, but it is suggested that people who are obese have an impaired leptin response or leptin production. And so that's part of why, even though leptin is produced by the adipose tissue, in obesity, leptin either isn't produced adequately or we're not responding to it adequately. And so the ability of leptin to reduce food intake is diminished. And then we have ghrelin. You might remember that was that ghrelin, that like growling hormone produced in the stomach. The growling because it stimulates appetite. Right? So that's a physiologic control of body weight. Potentially any issues with ghrelin production could lead to too much appetite or too little appetite, and therefore too much food intake or too little food intake. And then peptide YY is a protein produced in the gastrointestinal tract after a meal. And so it is supposed to work with leptin to decrease appetite, right? To increase that sensation of satiety. Okay, I'm satisfied from this meal. I don't need to eat anymore. And then also, people who have higher amounts of brown adipose tissue relative to white adipose tissue, this is more metabolically active adipose tissue. They have more mitochondria in the cells. And so people with more brown adipose tissue tend to have a higher total energy expenditure relative to people with more white adipose tissue. Other physiological factors, so this is kind of broken out into things that increase satiety or decrease satiety. So things that increase satiety, like satisfaction from a meal, so decreasing food intake. Serotonin and cholecystokinin, that's a little review from our digestion lecture. Again, that rise in blood glucose after a meal should increase satiety. That expansion of the stomach, remember the stomach can expand and contract down to like a quarter cup and up to almost a gallon, depending on the stomach. So as the stomach expands, we tend to feel satisfied. And also as we absorb nutrients from our meal, that theoretically also contributes to satiety. And then on the flip side, what are some things that decrease satiety or lead to an increased food intake? So beta endorphins, these are hormones that enhance a sense of pleasure while eating. And so again, potentially any malfunction with like beta endorphin production might lead to like continuous pleasure, and so continually wanting to eat. Also, something called neuropeptide Y, which is not quite a protein, but similar, almost like a protein. This molecule produced by the hypothalamus. It's an appetite stimulant. And then again, as our blood glucose levels drop, that's a basic physiologic signal to increase food intake. And then we have sociocultural factors. So I think these are really strong. These are basically learned behavioral behaviors that affect eating, which can affect body weight. So let's see, I guess maybe a few I'll point out would be inactive lifestyles and fast food cultures, right? These are increasingly common. So these tend to lead to increased body weight. Religious beliefs might affect the types of foods consumed or when food is consumed and when it's not consumed. Also, really strong social factors, I think, would be learned food preferences, right? Especially, I think a classic example is like not being exposed to fresh fruits and vegetables as a child. That is pretty commonly leads to that person as an adult not wanting to consume fresh fruits and vegetables. And also the reverse, like early exposure to heavily processed and refined foods basically sets that person up to really wanting those foods later in life too. Whereas more limited, controlled exposure to basically junk food during childhood and like healthy behaviors around junk food can teach a child how to, have junk food in moderation without kind of binging on it and becoming somewhat addicted to it. Economic status also greatly affects the quality and quantity of food that a person can buy. And unfortunately, we live in a world right now where unhealthy food is the least costly food to buy. So when folks are dealing with financial shortages, the easiest things to afford are unfortunately the least healthy for them. And then there's also social and cultural pressures to maintain, I would say I really meant to say unrealistic body weights. And so again, well, really males and females alike are affected by these social and cultural influences on what a body weight should look like. But really, as we said in the beginning, a healthy body weight can look like anything, so long as it's associated with other healthy physiologic measures and allows a person to eat well without intensive dieting or intensively overthinking about it, and also allows a person to, move about physically without restraint. Other social factors, appetite, again, meal timing and portions. We talked about portion distortion back in Unit 1, where we kind of live now in this world of supersized foods, right? I guess I haven't looked in a while, but I wouldn't be surprised if like the extra large bags of chips at the grocery store are actually cheaper than the single serve packages. Also, we're constantly marketed to with food. So seeing food advertisements either on the TV or on your phone or in a magazine, and also the smell of foods, right? So as you drive down a busy road with lots of different fast food establishments, they're literally pumping their smells out into the road so that you smell it and you want it. Your appetite is piqued even if you're not actually hungry. Mood and depression. So not for everybody, but a lot of times a depressed mood and sometimes even anxiety can contribute to more eating. We also have more and more barriers to physical activity. You talk about this day and age now of learning almost exclusively online, where students used to have to travel from one building to the next to get to different classes. Now they're just sitting, right, all day long, staring into a computer screen. And a lot of jobs are that way too, very computer-based. So people spending, 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day just sitting just to get their job done or get their schoolwork done. That kind of plays into our tech lifestyle. And then again, these social pressures, usually to be underweight, which, as we'll see, is not a healthy place to be either. All right, and now we're starting to kind of round into the last part of this lecture. We'll talk about why being obese is so dangerous from a health perspective, and then we'll talk a little bit about why being underweight is also very dangerous from a health perspective. So we know that obesity is directly related to chronic disease, and I've listed several here: cardiovascular disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, so hypertension having high blood pressure, dyslipidemia having like an unhealthy lipid profile, like having high LDL cholesterols, having low HDL cholesterols, having high total cholesterol in the body, diabetes, gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, sleep apnea, several different types of cancers, depression, and then many cognitive disorders as well, including Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and overall cognitive decline. So we know that obesity contributes to the severity of these diseases, and obesity can be part of the cause of these diseases developing in the body. So by managing a person's body weight, we can greatly reduce the risk for developing these chronic diseases in the first place, or at least reduce the severity of these chronic diseases. So really, really important. This is why body weight is so important. Circling back to abdominal obesity, so our brief conversation about fat distribution patterning. So abdominal obesity is referring to that apple-shaped patterning. Abdominal obesity, we also call that central adiposity. And when we talk about abdominal obesity, we're talking about visceral fat stored in the abdomen. Well, technically a large amount of visceral fat, because there will always be a small amount of visceral fat, no matter who the person is. But obesity is so dangerous because of this visceral fat stored in the abdomen. I have a picture to show you what that means. We know that obesity is a risk factor for developing or for being diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And basically, part of the reason why this visceral fat, this excess visceral fat, is so dangerous is because these fat cells will basically produce what are called adipokines, which are cell signaling proteins that are pro-inflammatory. And so now you've got these fat cells producing these pro-inflammatory compounds right around all of your vital organs. So that's going to impair the functioning of your vital organs, which is basically going to contribute to one or several of these diseases. So here is a look at visceral adiposity or abdominal fat. So basically we have, I guess we could say we have two types of fats in the body: subcutaneous, meaning just below, cutaneous referring to the skin, right? So subcutaneous fat is fat found just beneath the layer of the skin. We all have subcutaneous fat. That's not as dangerous as excess visceral fat. And this doesn't even show it very well, but that's unfortunate. So you could also Google and find a better picture of visceral fat, but you'll see some images where this fat is literally surrounding these different vital organs. This is just sort of showing it up close to the vital organs, but it literally kind of is around and surrounding them. So again, the excess visceral fat releases these adipokines, which may promote inflammation and therefore increase a person's risk for heart disease, right? Because your heart's right in here, type 2 diabetes, right? Your pancreas is right here, stroke, metabolic syndrome, frailty, and also Alzheimer's disease. So real quick, metabolic syndrome is basically a cluster of factors that if a person has all these different factors, we know then that they have metabolic syndrome, and that basically increases their risk for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and stroke. So the cluster of factors of metabolic syndrome, there are 5 of them. It's having abdominal obesity, it's having elevated triglyceride levels, it's having too low HDL cholesterol levels, it's having high blood pressure, and it's having high fasting blood glucose levels. So again, that central adiposity or that abdominal obesity is a waist circumference above 40 inches for males and above 35 inches for females. It's having triglycerides above 150. It's having HDL cholesterol below 40 in males and below 50 in females. It's having a blood pressure above 130/85. And it's having fasting blood glucose, so not after a meal, of over 100 mg per deciliter. And that includes somebody who's already diagnosed with diabetes. So metabolic syndrome, again, it's a major component of cardiometabolic risk, which is the risk for developing cardiovascular and other metabolic diseases. Again, type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disease. So cardiometabolic risk is basically metabolic syndrome plus four other, plus four other risk factors. So the four additional risk factors are having elevated low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, having inflammation, which remember we can measure by C-reactive protein. Okay, sorry, write C-reactive protein on your notes. I was going to change to pen, but having insulin resistance and also being a cigarette smoker, a chronic cigarette smoker. So this is the cardiometabolic risk score, basically. So including these four factors, your LDL cholesterol, your inflammation, your insulin resistance, and smoking, plus the 5 factors of metabolic syndrome. And so with all this, we know that obesity also is associated with an increased risk for premature death. A little bit more about how obesity might develop, right? We talked about the genetic factors, we talked about some social, societal, cultural influences. We talked about some of the metabolic and physiologic influences on weight. So this is just kind of an overview of all the different factors that can affect obesity. There's also this great chart from your textbook, the focus figure. It takes up a whole page, at least in the 5th edition of the text, focus figure 13.7. So maybe take a look at your textbook if this is too fine print. But I think this is a great chart. First of all, because obesity is very complex. It's not very straightforward, right? If it was, well, it wouldn't be such a problem. So let's see. Here's individual psychology, and you can see all the different aspects of individual psychology that might affect obesity. Individual activity level, all of that's going to play into energy balance. Food consumption obviously is going to play in. But then there's also basic biology, a lot of the things we talked about again, right? Genes, physiology, metabolism. There's also like, again, societal and cultural things. So the activity environment, and again, a lot of this is super fine print. I can't even really read it from the slide. So go into your book and review this. But you know, we talked about barriers to physical activity earlier, right? So kind of a world of learning online and working online, right? That doesn't lead to a lot of physical activity. Another thing that we'll talk about in this unit is food production. But in short here, we've been talking about, you know, we live in a world where unhealthy foods are so cheap and so readily available, and that's based on our systems of food production. And so that certainly contributes to obesity. And then also some societal influences. So right here it says exposure to food advertising, right? Also education. I think it's excellent that you guys are all taking a nutrition class. I think it would be even more excellent if we could teach nutrition in kindergarten through 12th grade, so that we could be learning about nutrition throughout the lifespan, and not just, you know, for a 5-month period once we're already young adults, or for some of you maybe adults, right? And maybe this is the first time you're learning nutrition. So education plays a lot into what we understand about food and what we understand about how food affects our health, and also what we understand about how weight affects our health. So yeah, again, I think this is a great just sort of FYI page. There's not necessarily anything on here that I'll test you on that isn't on the other slides, but just to start to become aware of what a complex issue obesity really is. So there's no one direct place to kind of address this issue. So a little bit about how we might treat obesity and how we do currently treat obesity. It doesn't say it here, but basically a slow, sustainable calorie deficit. So being in that energy deficit state. Healthy weight loss is suggested at even a ½ pound to a pound of weight loss per week. So it's actually a relatively slow, steady weight loss. And I don't know if I've said this before, but the way we calculate this number, 500 to 1,000 calorie per day deficit, is using this notion that 1 pound of fat mass contains about 3,500 calories. And so if we're trying to lose weight, we're trying to lose that excess fat mass. And so if we want to lose 1 pound of fat mass, we basically need to have a 3,000 calorie deficit. And so I just said healthy weight loss is about a ½ pound to 1 pound per week weight loss, right? ½ to 1 pound, and that's per week. So let's say we're going to try to lose 1 pound per week. That means we need to be in a 3,500 calorie per week deficit. So how do we make that per day? Well, easy math, which is nice. We have 7 days in a week. So 3,500 divided by 7, that's how we get this 500 number. So 500 calorie per day deficit should theoretically bring about a 1 pound per week weight loss. Obviously, doubling that to 1,000 calories per day, that would be a 2 pound per week weight loss. That doesn't seem to be very sustainable for most people. And again, even 500 is twice this range here, right? So potentially even a 250 calorie per day deficit would be good for someone. Also, of course, increase physical activity, but do it gradually, building up to at least 30 minutes per day, 5 days a week. Although the recommended physical activity for weight loss, we'll talk about next chapter, is 300 minutes per week. So that's actually like 60 minutes per day, 5 days a week for weight loss. Also, it can be really helpful to seek out support groups, work with a psychotherapist or a mental health counselor, or even just a health and wellness coach, just to have somebody sort of support the person on their journey through what is basically learning new lifestyle, learning new behaviors. There are some medications that can treat obesity. We don't know a lot about their long-term safety, so I guess I personally don't recommend medication for most people, but in some cases the medication can be pretty necessary as part of a more involved, more, I guess, broad treatment that also includes some lifestyle changes. So the medications often act as appetite suppressants. Some might also work to increase satiety, so in that way trying to help control food intake. And then again, of course, as with many prescription medications, there are often pretty serious side effects. Also some supplements. These are maybe even less less recommended than medication. A lot of times, as we saw with a lot of supplements, they can be sold without meeting FDA safety and quality guidelines. There's very little evidence to support the use of supplements for weight loss. Ephedra and PPA are two of the more common ones. Sometimes also stimulants might be used to be kind of a supplement for weight loss, but I don't see that as a pretty common, I don't see that as a very common effective means of weight loss. Then there are also actual surgical treatments that could be used to treat obesity. These are definitely considered last resort. There are very high risks, and also these risks are lifelong for undergoing a bariatric surgery. So there are three common types of bariatric surgery. There's basically the sleeve, there's bypass, and there's banding. And then there can also be liposuction, which is literally just lipo meaning fat, suction meaning sucking something out. So literally the excess fat might get sucked out of the person. This is figure 13.8 from your text, just showing the 3 different types of bariatric surgeries. So figure A is your, normal anatomy, where you've got the esophagus coming down into the stomach, and then the stomach leading into the duodenum of the small intestine. So in the sleeve, in the gastric sleeve, there's basically stomach stapling, where only a small pouch of the stomach is left, and the remains of the stomach are sort of sometimes, well, hopefully taken out, actually, so that you don't have this basically dead stomach tissue floating around. But now the person only has this much stomach left to work with. Obviously, we talked about the incredible importance of the stomach for digesting our food, for contributing to satiety, and for being critical to absorb different nutrients. So with a smaller stomach, we're at a pretty increased risk for pretty severe nutrient deficiencies. And there's also gastric bypass, which is also not great, where the whole stomach is literally bypassed, and there's just a tiny pouch of the stomach that's left and connected down to the small intestine. But the part of the small intestine is also often snipped out, which can be equally dangerous. And then there's the gastric banding, which again is putting a band around the stomach to try to slow processing in the stomach and basically slow the degree to which, or the amount of food basically that a person could eat at any given time. So again, these come with pretty serious lifelong health risks, and they should really be used only as a last resort. We'll review a few common weight loss diets here, and then we'll circle back to basically healthy weight loss. So weight loss diets, they kind of range from being relatively healthy to being basically crash diets that don't seem to work. So there have been some high carbohydrate diets that have been proposed. Some of these can work out, like Weight Watchers doesn't basically tell you what to eat, but they work on that point system. And their point system is pretty well grounded in the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. So eating good complex carbohydrates, high in fiber, eating moderate amounts of fat and moderate amounts of protein, but not low in any one of the nutrient groups. The downside with the Weight Watchers point system is that it can be pretty easily manipulated, and the person can stay within their point system while still eating pretty unhealthy foods and eating in very unhealthy ways. There's also Jenny Craig, the DASH diet, and again, the USDA food recommendations all follow this these basic AMDR patterns. So again, can be done well, but also leaves a lot of room for doing this poorly. Again, gradual weight loss is suggested, 1 to 2 pounds per week. That's a little higher than what I was suggested on the previous slide. But again, obviously following that same 500 to 1,000 calorie per day deficit. And this, if I'm not making this clear, this is a 500 to 1,000 calorie per day deficit, meaning taking in, basically eating and drinking 500 fewer calories per day than the person expends per day. Not my favorite, and would be low carb diets, high fat diets, and high protein diets. So some common names here would be, Dr. Atkins is a little dated there, but the Atkins diet, currently the paleo diets and the keto diets. And then I don't even actually know what Sugar Busters is, but that's from your text. So these are kind of interesting. So this suggests that 55 to 65% of total energy intake should come from fat, and the remaining energy should come from protein, and very little should come from carbohydrate. The keto diet, which I guess isn't written here, would actually be even higher, like 75 to 80% of energy comes in as fat. The thinking here with these, especially the keto diet and the Atkins diet, is that it would put a person into ketosis, which means that they're using more fatty acids as the energy substrate. They're also thinking that that would help to decrease blood glucose levels and insulin levels, which would hopefully regulate appetite better. There's very little research at this point around the healthfulness of the Atkins diet, the paleo diet, the keto diet for weight loss and for long-term health otherwise. So currently, we are kind of existing in this world of, there's a lot of uncertainty about the health risks associated with eating this way. Whereas we know from many decades and even centuries of data that eating according to the AMDR is quite healthy, as long as you're choosing healthy foods, because obviously you can still eat within the AMDR and eat make very unhealthy food choices. But this high protein, I'll say excessively high protein, excessively high fat, we don't have much evidence that this is safe long term. So how to lose weight safely? Basically, go slowly, work on building new healthy habits, set goals for yourself to build those habits. You can use the SMART goals acronym, I highly recommend. So making goals that are very specific, making them actually measurable, and then actually measuring them or tracking them. Make them achievable, which means starting small. Make them realistic for you, and make them time bound. So kind of have a due date or like a time component to it. Is it a daily goal, a weekly goal? Is it specific days, specific times of day? So this is a really, I think, helpful acronym, the SMART goals concept. And it is even recommended to work on daily goals. So some sort of behavior change that you can do every single day that is very simple, very achievable, right? Other things to do would be to choose low energy density foods, right? If you need to review what that means, going back to Unit 1, these are foods that do not have a lot of calories per mass, right? So these are pretty much whole unprocessed foods, a lot of what you've been cooking with in the labs for this class. So fruits and vegetables, beans and lentils, true intact whole grains, not processed flour foods. So lower energy density foods are going to be higher in water, higher in fiber. They're going to have a healthy amount of fat and protein. They're going to contribute to satiety without contributing too many calories. In that same vein, manage portion sizes. So start to choose smaller sizes. And again, these can be really small reductions in size so that over time you can work up to increasingly more significant portion size reductions. Start engaging in regular physical activity, definitely 5 days a week if you can, building up to even potentially 6, maybe 7. But that physical activity doesn't always have to be vigorous, right? It can be just general physical activity, leisurely, but just moving more undoubtedly is going to contribute to more energy expenditure. 2 other concepts that I really like that your book introduces are mindful eating and intuitive eating. Both of these involve a good bit of self-awareness, which I think is critical for long-term success in healthy weight maintenance. So mindful eating is basically this non-judgmental awareness of physical and emotional sensations that go along with eating or being in a food-related environment. So basically just being mindful of oneself relative to your eating behaviors and eating patterns. Intuitive eating is kind of interesting. There's maybe less research around intuitive eating. Both move away from this concept of chronic dieting. But intuitive eating is kind of like really also self-awareness, paying attention to yourself, doing it in a non-judgmental way, so without guilt. Recognizing that hunger is a natural part of eating, also being respectful of your fullness, so stopping eating when you're actually full, but also enjoying, letting yourself enjoy the pleasures of eating, because as you probably all know, eating can be quite a nice experience. So let it be nice rather than some sort of contentious thing. Again, another figure from your book, just looking at, doing this comparison of a high calorie, high energy density foods relative to a nice low calorie, low energy density food day. So just some obvious things, right? Choosing a piece of fruit, choosing a more whole grain breakfast, not consuming liquid calories, including more vegetables and fruits throughout the day, right? And these are whole vegetables, less processed, moving away from highly processed foods, right? All of these are highly processed, right? And including fruits and veggies at every meal, whole 9 yards. So you can see it's almost a half, almost reduces the calories by half. Right? And then you can also look at all those other good nutrients that we've talked about. It keeps the saturated fat low, keeps the fiber nice and high. Sodium over here is still relatively high, but significantly lower than on the left. Yeah. Okay, so then last little bit here is just talking about underweight. So underweight can be just as harmful as obesity, but for other reasons. Causes for being underweight, again, there can be some genetic contributors. Excess cigarette smoking can cause it. There may be underlying disease. There could also be an eating disorder such as anorexia nervosa, which may go along with some psychological issues that the person might be experiencing. And then again, of course, underweight is basically consuming too few calories relative to the amount of energy expended. So in order to gain weight back, if someone is in this underweight zone, and I guess it's not written here, but I guess I'll just say a few reasons for why underweight can be so dangerous. It can impair all the same body systems. So it can impair metabolic function, it can impair cardiovascular function, it can impair cognitive function, it can impair the immune system. So being underweight is not a healthy place to be either. That's why that healthy weight zone was kind of right in the middle of the BMI chart. So what can we do to gain weight back healthfully? You'll notice it's basically the same thing, but in reverse for trying to lose weight. So go slowly, gain, trying to gain a ½ pound to a pound per week, eat small meals frequently throughout the day, engage in exercise, but be mindful of the amount of exercise relative to caloric intake. As you're increasing calories, as always, eat according to the AMDR and don't be excessive with fat intake. Cease use of tobacco products if you are smoking. And again, part of that is because we know that tobacco products are an appetite depressant. And then just a little bit about protein supplements. I guess, yeah, I don't know, your book puts it here in this at the end of chapter 13. So I think there's a little more to say on protein supplements when we talk about actual physical activity coming up. But I guess it's here because sometimes protein supplements might be used as a means of gaining weight or even losing weight for some folks. So I think a really important piece to note is that protein supplements don't enhance muscle mass gain or show improvements in strength unless the person is actually well exercise trained. So I see it's pretty common for folks to take protein shakes as a means of trying to lose weight, but unless they're pretty experienced with exercise training and doing exercise training on a daily basis for that 30 minutes at a time minimum, there is no benefit to taking these shakes. And in fact, can even be leading to weight gain. Can also lead to issues with blood cholesterol levels and may also have influence on mood changes and mood disturbances. So unless you are a very experienced, very trained person with exercise, then the recommendation is to, yes, still consume protein, but get protein from food, not from a supplement, not from a liquid beverage, and to still engage in resistance training. But if you want to use shakes or amino acid supplements, actually get to a place where you are well exercised trained before using them. And I think that is the last slide for this chapter. So yeah, thanks for listening. And as always, if you have questions, email me, get in touch. And then I'll just thumb through these review questions so you can review them at your own time. Thanks all, and we'll see you next time.